Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this session on the power of storytelling that is a part of the 2020 NINDS Nonprofit Forum. We previously had forum sessions on June 29th and 30th, which are available on the NINDS website if you're interested. In this session, what we're going to do is emphasize the importance of personalized narratives in research, medicine, and patient care. I'm pleased to welcome Liz Neeley from the Story Collider and Dr. Sonia Vallabh from the Broad Institute to join us as our speakers today. What we're going to do is play a video of Dr. Vallabh and Ms. Neeley, and then I would love to encourage all attendees to use the question and answer feature that is at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. Please submit your questions there. We will be tracking it. And once we're done with our recorded session, we're going to go to a live dialogue with Liz and Sonia. Liz has been at the Story Collider for the past 5 years. She's also a lecturer at Yale University. Her background in environmental science also includes all aspects of science communication. And the Story Collider is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to personal stories about science told live. For Dr. Vallabh, she has her BA from Swarthmore College, a JD from Harvard Law, and her PhD in biological and biomedical sciences from Harvard University. She has done extraordinary efforts to co-lead an initiative to develop preventative drugs for prion disease at the Broad, and she's coming with a personal mission. I'm going to let her tell her story once we get started right now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Liz Neeley. I'm the Executive Director of the Story Collider, and I'm excited to have you joining us today for a session on storytelling, and specifically stories about science and how nonprofits can integrate these into their work. Dr. Vallabh and I are very excited to be joining you today. We'll be live for Q&A for 15 minutes at the end of the presentation, and we are excited to be a part of the Nonprofit Forum virtual meeting program. So let's get started. When I think of the word storytelling, I have to admit that it used to set my teeth on edge a little bit. I was a graduate student, I was a marine biologist, I was someone who had dedicated my entire young life to research and science and logic. And when I kept hearing, oh, you have to tell a story, it sounded like hand waving, like what you would do if your data wasn't strong enough. Or worse, in my mind, it sounded childish, like fairy tales or something like that. And I have to admit that I don't think I was alone in setting up this internal split. On one hand, there was science, everything that I found to be rigorous and logical and wonderful in how we create knowledge about our world. Then on the other hand, there were these stories. They were entertaining, sure, but I thought, at best they're frivolous, and at worst, they're manipulative, right? Maybe even unscientific. And here we are struggling for the attention of humans. But that idea that there is inherently a dichotomy, that these things are in opposition, is untrue. And much like this vaguely sexist meme itself, it's trash, and we need to move beyond it. So I spent the next 15 years of my career learning as much as I could from the social sciences, psychology, the humanities, looking to all these bodies of knowledge to understand, how do people make sense of our world? How do we process information? How do we decide what to do? And I think those questions are central to the kinds of operations that you as nonprofits are looking to work on. So if I can paint with a really broad brush, I can summarize so much of this field with sort of one central idea. And that is, for as good as we are at so many things, human beings tend to be spectacularly bad at understanding what other people think and why. We make colossal errors in presuming sort of chains of causality, of appreciating like, well, if somebody made this decision or has this behavior, it must be because they believe this thing. That doesn't hold up. We also are bad at estimating, what people appreciate about us, how much agreement there is with our particular point of view, and so forth. The biggest single error I see being made by people who come up through the research and the scientific training process is that we presume that the solution to any problem is to throw more information at it. That if only our audiences, if only our clients, our funders, or the general publics that we're connecting to, if only they knew what we know, then we would all be in agreement about what to do. That idea is called the information deficit model. It presumes people are empty vessels, just waiting to be filled with information. And once they are, things will be great. The only problem with it is that the information deficit model is a zombie idea. It is a stinking shambles. It has been disproven repeatedly in decades of research about how this works. In fact, not only do we know that throwing more information at apathetic or antagonistic audiences might very well do nothing to move them from where they are, sometimes it even makes it worse. It entrenches them in their positions or makes them think that they're even more correct. And so I wanted to understand, okay, well, if it isn't simply supplying accurate information that I need to do to create change in the world, what is it? I'm going to stick with this sort of creepy Halloween theme for 1 second and focus on the idea of stories, these powerful framing devices that help humans make sense of the world. So, for example, when you look through campaigns around scientific issues, one of the classics that's studied in communication research has to do with genetically modified organisms. And it is the instance in which Greenpeace took the idea of Frankenstein and then started calling things Frankenfood. It is remarkable what just these 7 letters, Franken as a prefix, can do in order to immediately make people think, oh, I know what this is. This is when an arrogant scientist does something unnatural, unleashes this monster into the world, and then suffers the consequences of it forever. All of that just from those 7 letters, Franken. In communications research, we're talking about framing. But stories are powerful framing devices. They can help explain why we do what we do and how we position ourselves and our organizations in the world. The reason I think that they work like this is because stories are powerful devices for resolving ambiguity collectively. So let's look at this in a visual way. If I show you this image on the screen and ask you what it is, you might have an answer for me. But that answer shifts spectacularly depending on the context, the other information around it. Stories are devices that human beings use to help us take overwhelming amounts of information about the world and focus it into meaning, to create meaning, to say who is the demon or the villain, who is the hero, what happens when you do X, Y, or Z. And it also seems to be the case that human beings process stories cognitively in a different way than other forms of communication or information packaging. So particularly when you compare stories to evidence-based argumentation, which is where I was most comfortable for sure, what we see is that there tends to be a number of strengths in storytelling due to this cognitive privilege. The first is that stories are just interesting. People want to listen to them in the first place. They want to keep listening to them. This next one surprised me. They're also more understandable. People comprehend information better in a story format than they do from bullet-pointed lists or statistics or graphs. So if you want people to pay attention to you and also understand what you're saying, there you go. But there's even one step beyond that. Stories are also more believable and more persuasive to audiences than evidence-based arguments are. And so for all of these reasons, I turned my attention to storytelling as the means for me to enact all of my science communication goals in the world. And what I've also been strongly reminded of, and it makes me laugh when you read the methods of some of these papers, is that intellectually understanding the research around narrative structure doesn't actually equate with having skill. And so really what we're talking about is both a science and an art form, right? So what we need to do is marry the theory and practice of storytelling. And this is what I do in my own nonprofit, the Story Collider. We produce live shows in pre-pandemic times. They were on stage, now they're on screen, where it's just a single person in front of a microphone telling a roughly 10-minute story. These aren't TED Talks. It's not pop-up magazine. There's no slides, no props. It's just a person telling a lived experience. Sometimes they're hilarious, sometimes they're heartbreaking. And it showcases the huge range of perspectives and people and lives touched and by science. We record all of these stories from these shows. And every Friday, a new episode drops on our podcast, The Story Collider. Download it wherever you get your podcasts. And what we're trying to do is show all of the hilarious, horrible, wonderful, heartbreaking, frustrating, all of the dimensions of science that go so far past what is presented in our papers and sort of the common stereotypes of science that people get on screen and in popular media. The final dimension of our work is that we teach storytelling workshops. So especially for those of us coming up in the sciences, we've accumulated, a lifetime of experience and expectations about what professional communication looks like and whether or not it's okay to be vulnerable or to be emotional. And so in our workshops, we're working to unpack that and allow us to bring the full force of our intellects together with these creative, artistic, entertaining devices. When I am talking about stories, you may have already caught on to me doing this. Storytelling is a buzzword right now, right? If you put a Google alert on that, your inbox will be absolutely flooded with blog posts and presentations and videos and people talking about how stories are going to make you a better leader and a better manager. They're going to improve your fundraising strategies, help you win grants, make your hair grow in thicker. It's a little overwhelming. So when I say stories, I mean something a little bit narrower than it's used commonly. In our definition, what we're focused on are three things. It is believable characters, experiencing some sort of meaningful events, and then coping with the consequences. Characters, events, and consequences. That's our definition of story. And so the next logical question is, okay, how? How do you tell a good story? And the first rule of storytelling is show, don't tell. So in order to help get this across, we've invited a storyteller to join us. Dr. Sonia Vallabh is going to give you a 7 to 8 minute long story about her experience. So we're just going to sit here and listen to this.
It's Sunday evening. Eric and I have spent the weekend at home, and we're almost ready to head to the airport when my dad pulls me aside. He sits me down on the edge of the bed and looks me in the eyes, looking more tired than I've ever seen a person look before. All weekend, he has not seemed himself. He's lost too much weight. I know that he's barely sleeping at night. It's only been 10 months since we lost my mom, and I've been telling myself that it makes sense that he's still grieving. But that doesn't explain why I feel like time is somehow only making it worse. The instant before he opens his mouth to speak, it occurs to me that something else is going on. I feel this preemptive rush of panic, like I know I won't be able to keep up with what's coming next. What he says is, I need to tell you something. It's about mom's disease. I'm 28. Eric and I have been married for 2.5 years, and this scene was nowhere in the lives we pictured when we said our vows in my parents' backyard in Hermitage, Pennsylvania, on this gorgeous summer afternoon in 2009. My mom was there that day, healthy and beaming. She was the force behind the whole beautiful party, dressed in this glittering yellow sari. Then, not long after, everything changed. To say that my mom got sick, to say that she died, does not do justice to the awful specifics of dementia, the way it takes your loved one and just peels them away from the world, from the inside out. Her illness came completely out of the blue, and then it moved at a speed that seemed to rip reality apart. Day to day, before our eyes, she was losing her ability to make sense, to communicate, to move, to eat, to sleep, to know who we were. When she died at the end of that year, I realized that I had already said goodbye. The person I loved had already been gone for months. She was 52 years old, and we had no explanation for what had just happened. It's almost a year later that my dad, as we sit there together at the edge of the bed, gives me the name for what we lived through: genetic prion disease. This is the terrible secret that he's been carrying around alone. This is what's been keeping him up at night as he tries to figure out how to tell me. My mom died of genetic prion disease, and embedded in that word genetic is a blow that I'm in no way prepared for. It means the story isn't over. I'm standing in the crosshairs of a genetic coin toss. There's a 50-50 chance that the hellish year of my mom's illness is not just my past. There's a 50% chance that it's also my future. Instead of just heading to the airport, I'm being launched on a completely different journey. Eric and I now find ourselves suddenly faced with this decision as little more than newlyweds of whether we should get genetic testing for a fatal, untreatable neurodegenerative disease that we have just witnessed in its full horror. Over the next few weeks, we hear a lot of advice from a lot of people. Basically, it all boils down to walk away. We talk to friends, we talk to family, we talk to professionals, and somehow they all share the same gut feeling. There's no treatment for this disease, there's no cure. So what good can possibly come out of an unlucky result? Ignorance is bliss, they tell us. There is nothing you can do. They all mean well. They want to protect us. But I'm finding that the limbo of 50-50 just won't leave me alone. I'm waking up every morning, flipping that coin in my mind over and over. I'm drifting through the motions of my day in a haze of panic. We're both learning that for us, there's just no leaving the coin suspended in midair and going back to our regularly scheduled lives. And if we can't rewind to a time before we knew that I was at risk, we can only go forward. And for us, even though the decision feels impossible to defend to anyone else, this means we have to know what we're up against. So, 2 months later, hand in hand, Eric and I walk in the door of the Adult Genetics Clinic at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. It's December 2011. We've come to meet our fate in the form of a predictive genetic test report. The report will tell me whether I inherited the single letter DNA typo that killed my mom. And I'm thinking to myself as we sit there in the waiting room, maybe today will be the worst day of my life. In this appointment, a piece of information that I've carried with me in every cell of my body every day of my life will be handed over to me by a stranger. Afterwards, I'll be exactly the same person physically, but I'll know something profound that I can never choose to unknow. The moment arrives. We're led into an exam room. Eric and I sit side by side, holding hands, across from a geneticist and a genetic counselor, and we watch helplessly as the coin flips the wrong way. I have my mom's genetic prion disease mutation. There in that hospital room, my world suddenly narrows in. I find that I can't even see 10 minutes into the future. I feel eerily calm, all of my attention focused on holding on to Eric, taking care of him in some little way in this dreaded moment. We continue to sit there for a long time, a million miles away from every other person on earth. That day, our worst fear was confirmed. But here's the thing. Despite that, the day of the appointment was not the worst day of my life. The worst day by far was when my dad told me that I was at risk. and I was thrown with no warning into that all-consuming 50-50 limbo. The worst day was the day the coin was tossed, not the day it landed. However unwelcome, at least now I knew, and slowly we began to adjust to this new piece of information. Neither Eric nor I had any science background, so we talked to our scientist friends. They pointed us to papers, so we started reading, trying to understand what was known about prion disease, and the process drew us in. It felt good. It felt energizing to face our enemy head on instead of hiding from it. It felt so good, in fact, that within a few months, Eric and I had left our careers in law and transportation engineering, and we had set about to completely rebuild our lives, retraining in biomedical science from the ground up. We took night classes. We found entry-level jobs in research labs. Eventually, we enrolled in a degree program. And in 2019, 8 years after we were handed that test report, we earned our PhDs in biomedical science from Harvard Medical School. Today, we run a lab together at the Broad Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we're working every day to develop a preventive drug for this disease in our lifetimes. I never could have told you, before I received my genetic test report, what I would do with it or how it could help me. But from the vantage point of today, that terrifying moment of learning the truth is what got us unstuck. It was the turning point that let the rest of our lives begin. It was the moment we went from trying to read our future to knowing that it's up to us to rewrite it. I don't know what lies ahead, but I've never looked back. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. That's incredible. I get goosebumps every time I hear it. So let's talk about what we just heard there. So if we go back to that framework I presented, characters, events, and consequences, and you think about within your own work, your own organization, your own research programs. First, when I say characters, I sort of am thinking about that in two ways. It is the person who is on stage or who is doing the speaking, doing the storytelling, and the degree to which we can identify with them, where it resonates and we think, oh, they're like me. I recognize them. And then there's also the characters in the story itself. And so in the example we just heard, we've got Sonia and we've got her dad and we've got her husband. And it's those interactions between the characters that help us appreciate the full reality of this person's lives. When you're thinking about storytelling from an organizational standpoint, I come back to a philosophical point of view that stories belong to their tellers and that we have to respect people's agency, that they are able to share their story in their own voice in an authentic way where it feels true to their lived experience, and that they also can control how it's used, because there is a tendency to want to decouple a story from its teller and then use it to call it content. And I think we have to be cautious about not exploiting people's stories, but rather working with them and building those pieces together. When I think of the cast of characters that your group might have to draw upon, it is your staff, it is potentially patients, caregivers, clinicians, basic researchers. There's a whole set of worldviews and perspectives that I think is really rich when we bring them together. The next part then is events. When I say event, what I mean from a storytelling perspective is something external has happened. A door closes, a car brakes. She says yes, something happens. In storytelling, in particular when we're talking about memories that might be difficult, one of the craft elements that you heard Sonia doing in her piece and is core to our style is we go back to the memories of that moment and we tell it as if it's happening in real time. This is called dramatic mode. And it's using the present tense, and it is centering yourself as a teller in that memory so firmly that you only know what you knew at the time. And you only had available to you what you could see and hear. And it helps not do this thing where we're constantly forecasting events or killing the tension in a story because we've already given away the punchline too early. In Sonia's story, we've got two major events. Her dad pulling her aside to share the news about her mom's autopsy results, and then sitting in that examination room and getting the results of that test. Those are the events. We also can think about how they're related. Everything else is exposition, right? It's explaining what's going on and why it matters and all the rest of it. But those moments, those things stick in people's minds, and it helps to create what's called narrative transportation, the beautiful feeling of being sucked into a story world. And that is important because that is where people engage in perspective taking. They engage in imagining the motivations of other people, and that's where the work of stories gets done. The final piece is consequences. So this is, in some ways, it's useful to think of it as an editing tool. So this event took place. Her dad pulls her aside. What happens because of that? What does it mean not to know that there's a 50-50 chance of having this particular typo in your DNA? You hear her through the story talking about the consequences of this knowledge or a lack of knowledge. When I think about storytelling in a performance sense, the final piece I'll say on this is that stories, if you imagine them going through time, have ups and downs. You know, there's moments where our tellers, our central characters are winning, and then when they're struggling. Emotional content to stories is what is linked to them being memorable, linked to them being powerful. And those emotions exist because the stakes are high. And storytelling is all about inviting your audience into this very specific moment in time, and then having them go through the experience with you and sit on the edge of their seats, holding their breaths, wanting to know, what did the test say? Was it good or bad? What are you going to do next to feel the goosebumps and the chills and the sorrow or the joy or whatever it is that makes sense for your story, for your organization's story? Now, when I take a big step back and think about this from like a strategic sense, as the director of a nonprofit myself, we all have to tell the story of our organizations. What I find is we often struggle to figure out, what are we going to tell a story about? It might feel very obvious, but it might not. And this takes me back to where I started in my own research in animal behavior, with the idea that once we are in search of something, we possess what's called a search image. And I'll give you a concrete example of this. If I say apple, you've got an idea in your head what an apple looks like. And so if I say, there's an apple somewhere in this room, find it, it's easy to complete that task. We do have sort of innate search images for stories. But what I've found through, 5 years now of running workshops for scientists is that when I say tell a story about science, many people tend to immediately reach for the biggest, most challenging, most dangerous, most, classically interesting stories that they've lived through. So they want to tell stories about sharks, for example, or a moment when everything changed. They went from this career into that career. But storytelling doesn't exist well when you're trying to cover an entire issue. It's really about a moment. So we want to get smaller. So let's stick with our marine theme. As a marine biologist, this is where my brain goes. If we now say, okay, a fish, even just sketching out the roughest outline, you immediately recognize this as a fish. You are primed. So you know this when you see it early on. If I show you a picture from the work I used to do in the field and say, where are the fish in this photo? Show me a fish. You probably see the big one in the middle. That's a wrasse. But you may have missed all the others in the image. And this is what the process of storytelling helps you do. It takes all of the material that is available to you from your own life, or to you in an organizational role from all the different people and experiences you've had, and get beyond just the obvious things to start finding the smaller, richer stories that can complement your overall focus. Now, the reason I'm talking about this, the reason I'm using these metaphors is because storytelling plays in this world of expectation. In the story, if you want to geek out about stories, we talk about canon and breach. So another way of saying this is that I don't have a specific algorithm. Other people do. The storytelling style at the Story Collider isn't that way. I can't give you like a Mad Libs format of fill in the blank and you'll have a story structure. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a formula that's useful in thinking about this. One of my favorite understandings about stories, the way that they set expectations, is to remember that human brains are prediction machines. The thing we are best at is gathering information about the environment around us and trying to predict what's going to happen next. As you can imagine, that's a powerful tool for survival. And it means that when we hear the beginnings of a piece, it sets expectation in our mind. When I show you the equation that's scrolling across my screen, I'm thinking about a quote from a science fiction author, Liu Shuxin, who says, "The stories of science are far more magnificent and strange than anything in our literature. Only science stories tend to be locked in cold equations that people just don't know how to solve." The equation that you're looking at right now is one that talks about this beautiful story that learning is what takes place when there proves to be a mismatch between what actually happens and what you expected, modified by the salience of the stimuli and the speed of your learning. In Sonia's story, she talks about, you know what? That wasn't the worst day of my life. We're playing with that expectation there. And so if you want people to learn something about stroke or neurodegenerative disease or any field of science, you want to surprise them somehow. And that surprise could be by the kind of person who's telling a story, the kind of story that they're telling, being funny when you were expecting to feel sad, being just fascinated when you thought you were going to be bored. And so as nonprofit leaders, as nonprofit workers, when I think about why you need to invest in appreciating what stories can do, and also build the kinds of teams that have the expertise to really make this a powerful part of your communications toolkit, I go back to sort of where we started. Why do we tell stories? We tell stories because we need to give voice to experience, to share what has happened to us. We know that this is an essential part of mental health. We know that in science and in the nonprofit world, anxiety and depression rates are very high. We need to be able to feel less alone in sharing what we've gone through. And this connects to the next piece about bearing witness to suffering. Because for all that we are throwing our lives into finding cures, sometimes there are times where our science is going to fail us. And so we need to be able to be present for people to truly see them and to at least stand there with them while they go through what they're living through. And stories let us do that. Stories also help us construct identity. What does it mean to be a member of an organization? What does it mean to be a scientist or a researcher? How do we form community? And given everything that we're living through in a pandemic moment of history, while we struggle to bring to life social justice goals so that our lives look more like our professed values, all of these things are important. And then finally, we tell stories, we share stories to galvanize action, to move people, whether that is to donate, to volunteer, to conduct research themselves. Stories are what helps humans connect. We feel less alone, we feel seen, we feel heard, and together we work towards something. My final note is to remind all of you, as you're doing this work, as you're telling your own story, or as you're creating a catalog of stories in your nonprofits, stories have this dual nature to them. They are both products and processes. It's easy to forget that they have this joint nature. It's easy to only think about the products. You know, what's the blog post that we're going to get up? What's the tweet we're going to put out? What's the video we're going to make? What's the end thing that we send out into the world, the way that we broadcast our message? There's so much value there, certainly. But don't forget how important the process of storytelling is, of working with your community, working with your staff and your storytellers, your patients, to understand how they see the world and how they want to tell that, to share that experience. That richens and deepens your collaborations as well. So as I come to the end of this presentation, and we look forward to your questions, I hope that you've seen how stories, it's not a replacement. It's an addition to your strategic communications toolkit. We need to have the data, we need to have the science, and to be able to share that cleanly and succinctly and efficiently. But we also need to have the emotions and the human side. We need to feel connected to the people who are doing this work of science. So I hope that you have learned a thing or two, thought a few things, felt a few things in this presentation. And I hope you remember that we all have stories. I hope you tell them, and I hope you tell them well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz and Sonia. So we are going to shift into our live discussion period and dialogue. I want to invite Liz and Sonia to unmute themselves and turn on your cameras if you could. I am going to disappear. I don't need to be in the middle of all of this, but continue to use the question and answer feature if you have any questions or points for clarification or wonderings of how you can apply some of what both Liz and Sonia have described to your own particular situation. We will keep a look, and we will let everyone get to talking.
Thank you, Sam. This is Liz. I am not able to start my video yet, and I know the team will be working on that. Sonia, can you talk? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm here
Wonderful.
too. Hi, everybody.
Hi. So why don't we just jump in? I'd like to ask you a question first. So I think such a gift that you've given in sharing your story with us in this presentation. And when I think about the time it takes to rehearse, to craft it, the vulnerability, sharing such personal memories, I feel like people want to know, why did you say yes to this? You have so many other important, urgent priorities. What motivated you to invest?
Gosh, it's a great question, and I'll give a little bit of like a historical answer. I feel like Eric and I have been telling our story for years now as we've gotten into science. In the beginning, it was really to convey that we were serious because we were doing something that that maybe seemed impossible. Like we were trying to transition fields in such a dramatic way. And I think conveying why we were there, like we both wrote our sort of application essays for our PhD program about exactly why we were there and what we wanted to do. And I think that was kind of a tool for us to show people we mean it, even if it's seems unlikely. Over time, I've come to think of it also as like, I think it's been surprising to find that we can do this work, that like maybe something good will come of it, fingers crossed. And so I've felt like um, a desire and a responsibility to put our story out there in case people see it and say, hey, like maybe I could do things that surprise me just as much as that surprises them. But I think I've also over the years become more aware of the way that telling our story is also for us. It's not necessarily a thing we do like entirely for strategy or entirely for others. I think it's this whole, sort of arc of our past decade has really grown out of this moment when we completely lost control of our lives. And little by little, like, there's still so many unknowns, and we like, go to work every day not knowing in what direction will it take us, and will we get to our goal? Are we going to develop a treatment for this disease in time? But I think even though we couldn't control the genetics that were handed to me, there is a way in which telling our story lets us claim back a little bit of control over what we've chosen to do with that and where it's taking us, and what we hope for and what we're working towards, even if the final word on that is years in the future. So
This
lots of reasons.
that resonates so profoundly with the field of narrative medicine, which has been deeply inspirational to me. And I know researchers and practitioners in that space identify how illness disrupts the narrative of our lives. In many instances, it gives you that clear breaking point between everything that came before and where we go next. And so this idea of self-authorship, that we are in some very real sense the collection of stories that we tell about ourselves and how we connect our actions and our pasts to our futures, is powerful. I have one follow-up question for you, and I know we've got some that have come in the Q&A. So Sonia, as someone who has been telling your story for years and also went through one-on-one story development with me to produce this for this, I'd love to hear you like sort of compare and contrast the actual process with kind of what we presented in the lecture form. Is there anything I didn't say that I should have that you have found really important or helpful in telling your own story on your own terms?
I think you did touch on this, but the thing that I found super helpful in our process of working together was, I think, exactly what you said about going back into a moment and really just sitting in it. And I certainly identify with what you said about the sort of rush to tell the whole arc of everything you want to communicate and everything that's ever happened. I think I sit through a lot of scientific talks where that's certainly like, you're just trying to pack in as much data as you can in your like allotted 15 minutes and it's go, go, go. And it was like a very useful reflective exercise for me to take a step back from, okay, like here's the biography of the past 10 years of my life and say like, what was the sort of seed of all of that? And what did it feel like then? Because like at that time, we didn't know where we were headed. And it's easy for me to almost forget that now. Like the momentum of what's come since then is like, all I think about is like where we're going and how can we get there? And the like just profound uncertainty of that time is like, I think a thing that it's useful for me to remember. Firstly, because that is, I think it's probably a thing that lots of people can identify with, those moments of just like total break, of total disruption, and trying to just put the pieces together and figure out where do I go from here, and maybe it's a surprising answer. But also because I think the sort of like forward momentum of just trying to get from to the next step and then the next step after that can sometimes be so powerful that I forget even though this is my story, I forget where we started. I forget to be kind of amazed that, anything good has come from that horrible time. And I'm always focused on the next frustration and the next hurdle and the ways in which I feel like we're not doing enough and we're not good enough. So it's, I think going back and inhabiting that moment has been a great exercise for me.
I love what you're saying there too, because I feel like storytelling offers this antidote in a twofold way. So some of the most powerful stories I've ever coached are experiences where someone's telling a memory, an event for the first time. And it's this catharsis and it's wonderful. But then also, many of us have stories that we have told and retold and retold so much that it starts to feel distant, and like we remember our telling of it and it just becomes like a rote performance that we do. And I love being able to reconnect with our past selves in this very meaningful way, to reclaim those parts of ourselves, because I do think many of us in leadership positions, many of us who are advocates in different varieties, it's your story doesn't feel like it belongs to you. You've used it in a strategic way, and I really like this idea of reclaiming. So I want to throw to the Q&A, unless you have anything else you want to jump in and say first.
No, that was lovely.
So we have many storytellers in the audience, one of whom I know has taken the Storyplatter stage before. So Hilary Savoy asks if I remember. Of course I remember you and your story. And I'll read this out just in case anyone can't see it. So she's saying her background pre-advocacy was in storytelling, and it's something she's brought to her work now. And a huge part of how she's been able to learn the relevant science with Possible is working with the researchers who study protein folding and binding sites. And so she asks, knowing that we can't send all of our researchers to storytelling trainings, I wonder if you have tips or resources on how, as advocates, we can best help draw stories out of the scientists in our space, either as they're teaching us or as they're interacting with our families. I think this is a very interesting part of the formulation of how do you elicit stories from scientists, because I know many of the people who come to my workshops have been trained, have been very specifically told that their credibility and their value lies in being objective and not having this emotional, vulnerable dimension to themselves. And I know from my own psychology, as someone who cares about science and wanted to pursue it early in life, that it's so appealing to think, no, I just need to focus on the data and not let myself be distracted. And so what I have done in my own work is attempted to apply, the first rule of Communications 101 is know your audience, know the things that they value. And so that's why you see me doing what I've done in today's presentation of here's this study saying this, and if here's a provocative question and here's how we answer it. But I also think no matter how much they protest, and some of them do, all scientists are human. And my favorite moment is when you get someone talking and they light up because you've just suddenly touched on their magnificent obsession. And suddenly they're talking with passion. And at Story Collider, we train our producers not to try and start shaping the story or go straight in with questions, but to focus on curiosities and confusions. And I think that curiosity part where you're cultivating a very active listening, you're using tools much like journalists do of oh, tell me more about that. Or I noticed you said this, can you talk about more what you meant by that, as a way to start pulling those out. Sonia, I'm curious if any of that resonated with you, or if you have additional things that you think would be helpful in answering this kind of question.
Certainly that does resonate. And I laughed a little bit when you were talking about people needing to be coached to remember that they're human because they've been trained to be scientific and objective for so long. I don't know that I have anything particularly useful to add, other than just agreeing that that people can certainly be drawn out, that everybody, no matter how much they resist it, can be drawn out into a more narrative mode that that can be really lovely.
I realize like there are specific questions that sometimes help move away from the data set and the analysis, the synthesis, and to the specific, the anecdotal. So really, I mean, like stories are anecdotes. And so maybe that's a way of thinking about this. So asking about firsts, like who do you remember who the first patient is that you've ever worked with this condition? Asking about moments of change, or my husband is a journalist, and I hear him start every interview with just saying, tell me a little, like before we get into what you found, tell me about the genesis of this project. Like what kicked you off? How did you get started? Those kinds of things. There's also a tool, like if you really want to get geeky about it, I noticed there's a life history inventory that's used by psychiatrists and psychologists in conducting interviews where you're eliciting people's life stories. And I thought, oh, this is fascinating. They're asking the same kinds of questions that my producers ask. What was a low point? What was a turning point? And also strong emotions. And this is tricky. Emotional literacy is not a strong suit of researchers, broadly speaking. But I think about, is there anything in this field or this research that has surprised you, that has frustrated you? Whenever people are talking about anger, rage, disgust, sorrow, usually there are stories attached to that because of those strong emotions. So thank you, Hillary, for asking that question. And I hope we've given you something to work with. We have another question for you, Sonia. What kind of advice do you have for nonprofit groups that are seeking more research into a rare disease?
Oh, great question. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like we sort of like came along and had to like figure out what existed for prion disease and what didn't exist. And as we've met more and more rare disease advocates over the years, I've come to really marvel at the ways that, like, in some profound ways, we're all in the same boat. And then in some profound ways, we're not. Like each disease has like its own idiosyncratic landscape of what do we know today and what don't we know today, and is there work being done, and is it the right work, and how much of it? I think we have definitely benefited from there sort of being a pretty robust research field for us to sort of step into and ask what's the role we can fill here. But I think a really inspirational figure for me in terms of nucleating a research field where there wasn't one is Josh Summers at the Chordoma Foundation. And I'm sure a lot of people listening right now know Josh well. But I think what I love is that it's his story of, you know, being someone personally affected by chordoma, saying, I have to do something about this, working in a research lab, and then making this surprising next pivot of saying, wait, being at the bench isn't actually the greatest impact I can make in this exact space. In fact, there's all this infrastructure missing. There's no biobank. There's no person who's sort of like connecting the dots between all of the tools that research needs to thrive. There are basic chemotherapy drugs that have never been tested against this rare disease. And he has ended up taking on this role of a facilitator that is incredibly impactful. So I love that, you know, he surveyed the landscape in such a thoughtful way, thought he knew how he was going to contribute, and then based on the data, right, sort of made a pivot and said, actually, I can grow this research field by doing this sort of other thing that isn't what I came in expecting. I feel like that is kind of an example to me of how responsive we have to be to the specifics. And I think it so happened that in prion disease, stepping in and doing research ourselves was, we thought, the way to make an impact. But I think in each sort of disease landscape, there are going to be different things missing. And it's just sort of this art to figure out, is it the number of researchers total? Is it the communication between the researchers and what we actually need is an annual meeting or some sort of like joint funding enterprise that could bring people together? Is what we need on the patient side, if we could create the resources that make this an attractive disease to study, would that then draw researchers in? I think we have seen some success in things like creating a patient registry and creating, our own little like sort of biobank, and some of these tools that, for us as a rare disease, provide some like a starting point for talking to researchers, talking to companies, talking to people who they have a lot of different directions that they can go with their amazing minds. And by sort of presenting a collected platter of resources, we can sort of make our problem attractive to them. So I think I guess the short answer is, I think there are a lot of good answers. And a lot of it depends on the details. But I think to sort of bring it back to today's theme, I do think that I've been amazed by what, when I look around me at the world of rare disease advocates, what people have been able to do with their stories, and how much sort of approaching people with like all of your own sort of personal goals on the table can draw people in, especially like to get to what you were saying, Liz, people who aren't used to that personal side inflecting their science. I think it's surprising, and it, for the right kind of person, can sort of illuminate their work in a new way. And that right kind of person isn't everybody. And like, in the end, I don't think we needed everybody in the prion field to be responsive to our story. We needed a handful of people to sort of stand up and say, wow, like, we want to help, come train in our lab. And we went from there. So that's kind of rambling, but I hope there's something in there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've found that really interesting and really helpful. So I know we're coming to the end of the hour, and I'm going to answer sort of two questions a bit smushed together too. We were asked, how long does the process generally take to help someone find their story? Is it a long process, or do you land on it right away? And then I also want to combine that with another question that was about, how do you encourage people to tell stories, especially if they feel uncomfortable potentially with their writing skills or their language skills, their speaking skills? The answer to this, just like riffing off of what Sonia, you were just saying, is it entirely depends on context. For Story Collider, for a performance, we typically say that we will go through between 3 and maybe 6 drafts with a teller. I like to use the metaphor of, this is a process of exploration. It's not that I can give you a map and say, this is our end point, and here's the desired path to get there as efficiently as possible. Instead, it truly is exploration. I don't know where the mountains and the bogs are in your life or in those events. I can give you a compass and give you a heading. And then together we will search for the best way to get there and be clear. Sometimes it's very easy and very straightforward. And other times stories are meaning-making devices. I can't tell you the number of times I've been in the process of developing a story with someone, and they finally are like, oh my gosh, I never thought about it this way before. It feels like therapy almost sometimes, because suddenly you realize what that past event actually meant to you, and then you can tell this story. And then the final piece is, stories are powerful. They're not, and I think stages are powerful. Sometimes you hear people using this rhetoric of like, oh, we give disempowered people a voice. And I think people have voices. They always have. but allowing different kinds of people to take a stage and tell a different kind of story. That's a source of power, because our stories are who we are, how we survive, who is powerful, who has earned our attention. And I think that building this practice of centering the voices of people who are most impacted, not necessarily those who most classically, adhere to a particular style of public speaking, is something that will make all of our work more salient, more inclusive, better, and more directly relevant to helping to solve the urgent problems that bring us together. So it's 4 o'clock, and Sam, I was just thinking you were about to pop in.
Yes, thank you both. I really want to take a moment to thank you, Liz, and to thank you, Sonia, for sharing with us and with our audience your own personal explorations into using narrative to convey information to other people, and for really helping us understand the process and how we can all use this as a tool to really connect with others and to really achieve a mission that might be for any sort of disorder or scientific area. I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Of course, our logistics contractors who helped to set all of this up and run this. I know we weren't able to get to quite all of the questions that we received, but we do have them collected, and we can follow up after the fact via email. And we've been recording this so that we can use this as the great resource that it is on the nonprofit forum website that NINDS manages, so that you should be able to share this with your colleagues and those who maybe weren't able to join us for this particular hour today. So once again, thank you so much to both Liz and Sonia, and thank you all for joining.